everyone. Welcome to Every Genesis Song Ranked. Today we're going to be counting down numbers 39 to 30. Now, just a word before I start. It is dreadfully hot here. We're in the middle of a heat wave, and if you can probably tell from the shape of the roof, but my office is on the top floor of the house, and I've had to turn all the fans off to avoid interference with the audio. So if I seem to be rushing a bit, or if I'm grotesquely sweaty, I apologize for that, but, unfortunately not much that I can do. I do want to just throw in a quick word of thanks to all the folks who've been watching and commenting. I've really appreciated folks' thoughts. There's some really good points people are making that I do want to try to eventually address maybe in a separate video once I'm done with everything. I try to respond to as many comments as I can, but there's some interesting thoughts that I really want to spotlight when I do get this main set of list videos done with. As always, I'm Hans from Electric Brain, Electric Shadow. We are a contemporary art rock project that strives to create music that is emotionally nuanced, melodically appealing, but still more complex than your average pop song. You can check us out on Bandcamp or your favorite streaming service. Number 39, I've put It. This is a really great driving rock song that feels unusually close in style to some of the mainstream rock of the period, though not in a way that it suffers from. The lyric to this is interesting to me because it seems to signal a little bit of a transition into the style of the earlier Gabriel solo work, the lyrical voice, particularly the way that he's using rhymes and culture references here, feels more like something that he would do in 76 or 77 than something he would have done in the earlier Genesis days. The line, "Look across the mirror, Sonny, before you choose, decide," that feels like something he would say on the Car album or the Scratch album. And, as an album closer, obviously this isn't really going to compete with Supper's Ready or Cinema Show, but I do still think it's a rousing finale. Just as a note, the overdubs on the Archives box got a pretty bad rap for totally understandable reasons, but I really, really enjoy that version on the first Archives box with the studio recording from the original time, but the kind of richer, thicker voice of 90s Gabriel. And honestly, hearing that version of the song maybe unlocked some fondness for it that I might not have had otherwise, and it maybe even contributed to this ranking as highly as it did. Number 38 is another Lamb Lies Down on Broadway song, Anyway. I love this because it has one of the most surprising and sharp dynamic shifts in their whole catalog. A lot of the time they were pretty good at, relatively subtle build-ups, but here, you have this moody, sedate, relatively simple piano figure. It's worth noting here that the main piano hook, of course, goes back a few years to the Genesis Plays Jackson project, and it does have a little bit of the kind of more simple, obviously hooky quality of some of the material from that time. All of a sudden, it pauses, this thunderous guitar solo bursts in, it pauses again, it goes back to where it started. By this time, their dynamic shifts were generally smoother, but I think that the oddness of that actually paradoxically ends up making it more effective and appealing. In some of the earlier videos, I've stated that the third side of Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is, I think, somewhat underrated even still, and it, to my ears, contains some of their most effective work. And there's one thing in particular that's going to show up much higher on this list. This is, I think, a relatively straightforward but very affecting piece that I'm really quite fond of. Number 37, I've put Cul-de-Sac, which is, of course, one of the most old-school tracks on Duke. This is one of those kind of miniaturized epics that they did a fair amount in the middle period. When I say a miniaturized epic, I mean that, it's not really much longer than something like Misunderstanding. It's got a verse and chorus that are pretty much recognizable as such, but there are a lot of bits of musical information that are crammed in to that relatively short space. You know, there's an intricate, really tightly composed intro and outro, and there's a really pitch black lyric that's either about biological warfare or sorcery or, sorcery as a metaphor for biological warfare. It's probably coincidental that the lyric focuses so intently on how the passing of time brings inevitable obsolescence and extinction, but it makes a mean kind of sense. Even though the song itself balances catchiness and intensity and complexity so well that its very goodness kind of undermines its own argument about itself, if that makes any sense at all. Number 36, we're coming back to another Lamb song with Chamber of 32 Doors. You'll hear sometimes that a very small detail, if it's perfectly calibrated, can elevate a song. And one of my favorite things about doing this ranking has been noticing details I wasn't aware of before. That little piano chime at the very end of this track probably lifts it about 10 spaces. I suppose you could read a little bit of Banks Gabriel's psychodrama into it, right? It's Tony insisting on having the last word, but that's just projection. That's neither here nor there. I was talking on the song anyway about how some of the section transitions there are a bit less smooth than what the band would usually do at this stage. The same thing is true a little bit here, right, where the move from the style of one section to another can be a bit jarring, so it maybe doesn't quite have the momentum that it could as an overall piece, but the mellotron and guitar intro is just one of their most kind of beautiful, sweeping bits of crimsonish, autumnal eeriness. And Gabriel's delivery of the lyric is really effective in the sense that he wrings genuine pathos out of what's essentially an absurd situation. Number 35, I have Behind the Lines. There may not be any other song in their whole catalog that's quite as neat a microcosm of the prog pop duality, right? And the transition between those two styles. The piece opens with this memorable, fairly neoclassical theme. It winds through a bit of instrumental elaboration, and then it moves into a almost funky groove, which then builds to a fairly dire crescendo. You can hear Phil being a performer here in a way that he hasn't up until now. His vocal delivery is dynamic, and it matches the mood of the music, and it really wrings every possible bit of emotion out of a lyric that is heartfelt, but at the same time, when you dig into it, actually kind of obscure and odd. So this is notable as a piece because it's encapsulating a really diverse album and a period of change, and putting both of those things into what's also a very fine song. Number 34, I have Madman Moon. Now, I've put that higher than some of the more beloved live staples from Trick of the Tail, which may spur some disagreement, and I do understand that. But it's just a gorgeous, wonderfully constructed song. The opening of it is quiet enough that I think it's easy to miss how elegantly composed it is. And the first part of the instrumental interlude is mixed in a way that makes it feel kind of far off and a little bit hard to take in some of its details. This is a mid-album song, a relative deep cut, and not too hard to overlook as such, which is unfortunate because it's wonderfully elegant, it's intricate. At the same time, it's another great example of many on this album, how the right melody and vocal line can wring real emotion out of a fantasy situation. The loud part in the middle is maybe not quite as effective as the rest of it, but, it's a proportionately small bit of the overall work. And after almost 30 years with this album as a part of my life, this is one of the pieces of it that's continued to stir the strongest emotion in me. There's just something that I've really come to appreciate about the way that this song is exemplary of their ability to build little worlds in a very confined space, right? To make something that has a universal quality and then condense it into the least amount of space necessary to get the idea across. In fact, the lyric here, with its mixture of humor and melodrama and pathos and nuanced character and the voices that come in and out, is, I would say, one of the most effective of the whole Gabriel era. Does a lot of things that people appreciate, for instance, about Battle of Epping Forest, but in a much more condensed and effective way, though it admittedly, with somewhat less wordplay, puns. That's been one of the themes of this run, I think, actually, is relatively short songs that achieve a lot in a small space. And that I think can be underrated a bit because they don't have the gravity on an album that a longer piece like The Musical Box does. Mike's bass fills on this song are absolutely exemplary. They're some of my favorite playing that he ever did, and my sense from his autobiography is he still thought of himself as relatively inexperienced with the instrument at this point, but the way that he's filling details, building momentum, accenting things is really marvelous on this track. And the drawn-out reverb on the final second of vocal at the very end of the song as presumably Harold falls to his death, that little bit and the way that that holds the space. Again, it's those kinds of little details that can make a piece sometimes. I bought the album Trespass when I was 11, and I found this particular song so terrifying that for the first few months, not only did I not listen to this song, I didn't even listen to the song Dusk because I was worried that I might forget to push the stop button and accidentally hear the knife. Of course, the scariest things when you're that age are also the things that become the most enticing once you face that fear, and as you would imagine, I did eventually become very attracted to this song. That loping organ figure at the beginning has kind of like a friendly, scary quality, like a rabid St. Bernard. I think that's actually more unsettling than straight heaviness would be. And the individual bits after that maybe don't always have quite as much flair and character as some of the instrumentals on the later work. But the verve and daring and personality that are on display here are really wonderful. Now, the studio version is hindered a bit by John Mayhew's drumming. The version on Genesis Live, as much as I love that album, maybe isn't Peter's best vocal performance, so perhaps no perfect version of The Knife exists. But the versions we do have are stupendous, and I just think it's fantastic that there's at least one thing in their catalog that is this just straightforwardly vicious. As I already mentioned, Duke is, I think, rather full of underrated songs. Many of those seem to be coming to greater attention in the fan community. This one seems to have gained a lot more respect lately, in spite of the fact that Mike dissed it in his autobiography. There's just a frightening energy here that they didn't summon very often at this point in their career. And Phil is just shrieking this lyric, which is evocative, but at the same time inexplicable. The wall of sound production quality that Duke has really helps sell the intensity and the psychodrama of the piece. And there's a moment near the end where the kind of lumbering, staggering, halftime rhythm switches into a mid-tempo normal time beat. That shift in rhythm at that moment is one of the great little kind of unacknowledged bits of Godhead in their catalog. Credit, by the way, to the Tabletop Genesis podcast for pointing out that moment, which I think had heard but never quite consciously put my finger on before. Number 32, I have The Musical Box. Now, Tony has said that the beginning and ending of this song are the most important parts, that the stuff in the middle is negotiable, and I don't think that's an unreasonable perspective. The opening, of course, is a delicate, eerie elegy sung by the ghost being elegized. The ending is a seduction that turns into a tantrum, which still feels like a relevant thing today in spite of the fundamental absurdity of the story. I'm actually personally quite fond of the live version from 1992, which Phil sings with a really remarkable level of sensuality, given the fact that in context it's both pedophiliac and necrophiliac. Now, going back to Tony's point about the beginning and the ending, It is true, I think, that the opening and closing tell most of the story, they set most of the mood. The solos in the middle could be perhaps replaced with other solos without too much of a loss of the overall effect and quality of the thing. The composition overall maybe does feel more like a series of bits pasted together than most of their other long songs. But all those bits are fantastic as bits, and it's very hard to think of a better way to spend 12 minutes. All right, thank you very much, everybody, for your attention and your thoughts. Liking, commenting, subscribing are always helpful. And I'll be back in a couple weeks to get into the 20s.